Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman have 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
I thank the chairman. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the issue generally. I might have more to say to respond to a few of the comments made by my colleague, Mr. Raskin, and some others, but I'm going to focus on the amendment currently for the sake of time and try to move forward. That we've discussed, obviously, we just had a vote on an amendment excluding and trying to protect the rights of law-abiding citizens in South Texas and those along the border to be able to defend themselves in the absence of security provided by the federal government, which the Constitution contemplates specifically. And in this case, it's meritorious to consider the danger that is being created for the American people in cities throughout this country, in cities in particular that in jurisdictions that have reduced their law enforcement budgets and what we might generally say defund the police. In Austin, for example, which I represent, Austin cut $150 million in their police budget, about a third of that budget, decimated the recruiting classes of the police academies, made it very difficult to hire. They've been losing police by the dozens, by the hundreds in terms of where they are. Their numbers are at historic lows relative to the growth of the population in Austin. And I would note that that has resulted in significant increased crime in a great number of jurisdictions across this country. In Austin, for example, it saw its deadliest year on record with 89 homicides, annihilating the former record of 59. We're currently on pace to match last year's record, having had 39 homicides through the first half of this year. Chicago reached at least 800 homicides in 2021, a level not seen in 25 years. Portland recorded 90 homicides last year, shattering the city's previous high of 66. New York recorded a 44% increase in homicides. Seattle saw their homicide rate increase by 61% in 2020. And what do these cities have in common? Each of those cities defunded the police or cut officer positions after the summer of 2020. And the bad policies and bad rhetoric from our leaders got us here. In the 2021, at least 12 major cities broke their previous homicide records. And the defunding efforts have trickled down impacts that will worsen crime. 2021 was the deadliest year for law enforcement officers in the United States history. Fatalities increased 55%. A lack of law enforcement hurts everyone. The 911 calls aren't being answered in Austin. It's a pervasive problem, and I've been reading stories about that in jurisdictions and cities throughout the country. Aggravated assault is up in Austin. Crime is up. And all of this gets back to the point of the ability of the American people to defend themselves. And I would note, as the gentleman from Florida noted, I'm not here to suggest that a full presence of law enforcement or a fully funded law enforcement necessarily should give us any great comfort to the point of what we obviously witnessed in Uvalde. Now, I'm still waiting for reports to figure out which law enforcement to blame, but there's no question that there is blame to go around across the various law enforcement levels as we continue to get the reports, as we saw the reports that were released last week, or I think it was last week, earlier this week, in the Texas legislature. It's an appalling situation, but again, I'm going to reserve judgment officer by officer until I get the full reports, or department by department. But the point remains is that the ability for the citizenry, ability for the people to defend themselves and arm themselves is nevertheless important. And that is something that, of course, in certain jurisdictions across the country have allowed schools to have teachers be able to arm themselves. There are certain jurisdictions in the state of Texas, including some that I represent, that have chosen that path to be able to defend themselves or defend the schools. And I think that we're trying to have a debate here about specifically targeting certain weapons. Obviously, I disagree with that underlying premise, disagree with taking that right away from the citizens broadly and generally, and frankly, very much in line and agreement with the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Sparks, with her rhetoric, from her firsthand account and knowledge of what she experienced in Ukraine and watching her former countrymen and countrywomen deal with the invasion by Russia and the fact of what they're dealing with in Ukraine. She very eloquently laid out why the fundamental right is so important in this country and should be enjoyed and experienced by all. But obviously, we're dealing with legislation that would strike that right with respect to a class of weapons. Again, I disagree with, but I would like to preserve that right for individuals to be able to defend themselves, as earlier I said, along the southern border, which is being ignored by the federal government to the peril of the people of Texas, but in addition to the jurisdictions that have chosen in a fairly, I think, coordinated national way, but certainly individually in each city, in a number of cities, including Austin, to defund their police. And for that, I would ask for an exemption for the people in those jurisdictions, and I would yield back.
Gentleman